Okay, this screencast is going to pick up with Parliament compromises, and I just want to say you may have to edit your outline a little bit because I have taken some things out. So with the Sons of Liberty and more importantly just the overall Patriots drawing attention to colonial interests and some of the things that they think are unfair, Parliament is going to decide to work with them a little bit for a minute, and they will repeal the Stamp Act, which means get rid of it, and they will also have the Sugar Act changed to an even lesser tax, so they further reduce the percentage. But unfortunately, this compromise will not last long, because when a new prime minister comes into town, or comes to power, and his name is Charles Townshend, you don't have to know his name, but you will know his last name because the acts that are passed are named after him. But essentially, Townshend is going to place another series of taxes on the colonies, a tax on paper, paint, glass, and tea, which is kind of key. Okay, so the Townshend Acts do include a tax on tea. You know how the British feel about their tea. Okay, so the colonies are really going to be unhappy with these new set of taxes, which is going to cause them to start debating and resisting the British control once again. There is another boycott of British goods organized by the Sons of Liberty. They're kind of back to their own tactics of radically rioting in the streets, particularly in Boston, as well as fighting back against some of the British soldiers that are present in the colonies. And just throughout this process, the colonies are kind of becoming more united because they are very frustrated by these new taxes placed on them. Parliament is actually getting upset by some of the resistance they're seeing from the colonies, so they're going to start increasing the number of British troops being sent to the colonies, particularly Boston, because Boston seems to be the place where so much of this these tensions are centered around. So they are going to send more troops there, which of course just make the colonists even more annoyed than they were. Now, when the colonies choose to start boycotting British goods as a sign of protest, that does affect British merchant groups. So those British merchant groups are going to ask Parliament to repeal the Townshend Acts because it hurts their business financially when the colonies don't purchase their stuff. So Parliament is going to agree to that, and they will remove the taxes from all of those items I mentioned in the Townshend Acts, except for the tea tax. The tea tax is going to stick. So just kind of start remembering that because that's going to come into play later. But the fact that the tax is just left on tea, the colonists are happy that the other taxes got removed and eliminated, and they're just going to honestly start drinking smuggled tea, which is illegal, but they just are going to start avoiding paying the tax overall by smuggling in tea that's illegal on the black market. All right, I want to talk about the Boston Massacre, which was an event obviously taking place in Boston and something that most people are familiar with, and I think we've all seen this picture that I have on the PowerPoint slide at this time, but we're going to go into some clarifications. So Boston is really filled with tension at this time, just between, especially between the two groups, the soldiers that are being left in the city of Boston and the colonists who were unhappy about them being there, many of them being patriots. On one day in 1770, a group of colonists will kind of gather and gang up on a group of British troops that were stationed outside of a custom house. And they're going to taunt the British officers. They're going to jeer at them, yell things at them, throw snowballs at them, kind of provoke them. And we don't really know exactly what happened in terms of what the intentions were. We do know that a British soldier's gun went off. Again, not sure if this was intentional or if it was a mistake, but it did kind of confuse and throw off the other soldiers. Once one gun was fired, they all started shooting into the crowd, which is why several colonists are killed. 5 colonists are killed from the shootout in total, including the name you see there, Crispus Attucks. He was actually a fugitive slave, but he's considered to be the first person killed in the revolution, even though the revolution isn't officially the revolution yet. It's turning into that. So, but 5 people are killed. Again, the thing is, we don't really know if this was not really a planned attack, and it's not really, taught that way sometimes, and this picture definitely doesn't paint that image. But we really kind of think that potentially the soldiers were just being provoked and one gun went off, and then that sparked several shots being fired. But it's going to be patriots that actually label the event as the Boston Massacre, using it as propaganda to kind of stir up the colonists against the British. Because, the word massacre makes it sound very deliberate and intentional, and we don't really know if that's the full truth there. We're going to dissect this picture a little bit more in class together on Friday. This is from the site of the Boston Massacre in Massachusetts on the Freedom Trail, and that's the grave site of the 5 victims of the massacre. Okay, so we're now going to talk about the cause and effect between the Tea Act leading to the Boston Tea Party, and that'll be the last thing, and the effects of that, and that'll be the last thing we talk about in today's screencast, okay? So, in 1773, not that you have to know that year, but just in this time, the Tea Act was passed. And the Tea Act was actually an act that made tea very much more affordable if it was coming from one specific company, merchant group. So essentially, there's one specific company, the British East India Company. They were not doing that well financially. And so Parliament is trying to help that group out by saying, okay, well, there's currently a tax on tea in the colonies, but if they buy your tea, they're not going to have to pay a tax. Like, we'll eliminate the tax on tea specifically for your company, and then hopefully they'll be inclined to purchase your tea. Okay? Now the problem is that the colonists were smuggling in tea anyway, and so they weren't paying the tax to begin with. And now this is hurting the middleman who was illegally smuggling in tea on the black market for all these years, because now colonists are actually going to choose to go buy the tea from this one particular company. I think it's also a matter of England's doing this not for the benefit of the colonists, but for the benefit of one of their own merchant groups. But essentially, this is a very interesting revelation, because what I'm telling you is that the colonists are not even technically being charged an extra tax with the Tea Act. The Tea Act actually eliminates a tax for one specific company. You would think they'd be happy not to have to pay the tax at all anymore on tea, but certain groups, particularly in Boston, are very angry about this one British merchant group getting the advantage over colonial merchants. So that's the group, the radical group out of Boston, the Sons of Liberty, that are going to organize this event called the Boston Tea Party. Essentially, they try to not allow any British East India Company ships from being able to dock in the Boston Harbor. Because in theory, well, if they can't dock, then they can't unload their tea and sell it to the colonists. But nonetheless, one ship will be able to dock, and the Sons of Liberty will respond to this by disguising themselves as Mohawk Indians, sneaking onto the ship, and pouring 45 tons of tea into the Boston harbor. And that event is known as the Boston Tea Party. That was a very expensive protest for England, and obviously something that's going to make the British Crown very angry and Parliament very angry. I did not pay the extra price to go on the Boston Tea Party museum. It's like a ship that they actually have in Boston's harbor, but Miss Peavy did, and she let me share her pictures. This is her being a true rebel and mimicking throwing tea into the Boston harbor to reenact that. So that's something you can also do on the Freedom Trail. Okay, so like I said, England's really mad at Boston in particular, since they had participated in this kind of expensive protest. So Parliament will respond to the Boston Tea Party with a series of laws called the Coercive Acts. They are essentially a punishment on specifically Massachusetts and Boston, the city, but Massachusetts is a colony as a result of the Boston Tea Party. These are also known as the Intolerable Acts by the colonists because they are hard to tolerate. So the Coercive Acts do 4 things. It closed the Boston harbor until all the tea was paid for, and if the Boston harbor is closed, that means that goods cannot come in or go out. And think about how they make money, via exports. So they're not allowed to sell and export goods until all that tea is paid for. The second part of the Coercive Acts was that the entirety, or the entire Massachusetts government was placed under a military government. So there's no more free legislature or representative democracy. The military, the British soldiers, are going to come and control the Massachusetts government. Third, the colonists had to provide for food and shelter for even more British soldiers because they're going to increase the number of British soldiers being sent into Boston. And then finally, trials for British officials could be transferred to England. And this is kind of a complex one to understand, but essentially what I'm saying is if a royal officer or British military official committed a crime in the colonies, potentially against a colonist, they would be allowed to be sent back home to England for their trial, which really isn't fair for the colonists if the crime was committed in the colonies. Like you think that it would be more fair and the outcome of the trial would be more fair if the colonies got to try a British officer, but they're letting them kind of have an advantage by letting them go home for their trial where they might not be taken as seriously and they might be able to get off a little more easily. So that's just like the final punishment on Massachusetts by the British government. And that's a hard pill for the colonists to swallow. Please write down any questions you have about the notes we covered. I know it was a lot. Especially the Tea Act and how that actually worked economically. I'm happy to answer that for y'all in class on Friday. But I hope you all have a good day. And like I said, just write down any questions you have.